remain standing for our reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 1 through 8, verses 14 through 15, and verses 21 through 23. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. There are also many other traditions they observe, the washing of cups, pots, bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, the people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold a human tradition." Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they are what defile a person." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. When is the last time? When's the last time you saw this video? Follow the wisdom of Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time to speak and a time to keep silent. Okay, now it's time to speak. What I was going to say earlier is a quote from my mother. "When is the last time you washed your hands?" I can't tell you how many times I've heard that over the years. Teresa can attest to that. If you couldn't give my mother a time pretty much in the present, you were wise to respond, "I'm washing them right now." My mother worked in healthcare for years and years, and from her perspective, you'd better clean your hands recently, especially when you're getting ready to eat, or if you were in the kitchen helping her in some way. Say, "Oh, I'll help with that." "Did you wash your hands?" She would say that. That's become kind of an inside joke in our family. And sometimes out of the blue, I would tease my mother with that. I would tell my mother, I'd say, hey, Mother. She'd say, yes. And I'd say, I washed my hands not too long ago. Then she'd give me that, don't mess with me look. But you get the picture. You know, in light of what we know about germs that spread and fear of viruses, things like that, infectious diseases, you know, hand washing has become an important activity, right? I mean, you know, you go back just anywhere, restaurants, you go in hospitals, any care facilities, you know, and there are hand sanitizers because you know, that's important to do, right? You wash your hands, right? Those in favor of doing that. Anybody else want a moist towelette? I've got several. Okay. Well, if hand washing is so beneficial to health, why is there a controversy between Jesus and his disciples and the scribes and Pharisees? I mean, the scribes and Pharisees want to know why Jesus hasn't taught his disciples how to participate in a washing ritual that's in keeping with an accepted tradition. I mean, this was not biblical law, but this was an interpretation or something else added to it. It's a good rule, Mr. Jesus, and we might agree, you know, hand washing is a good thing. Well, of course, we know that the hand washing here had little to do with any kind of idea about getting rid of germs. They weren't even thinking of that at all, of course. You know that. It was more of a symbolic act of keeping oneself from being contaminated by external contacts. People that might not be clean, religiously speaking. Situations like that. You don't know what kind of people that may have touched the food that you eat or what kind of persons you may come in contact with. It's just a prescribed way from certain religious teachers to make sure that you remain pure like the law says you're supposed to remain pure, right? Now, you would think that Jesus would have at least congratulated these religious folks for their efforts to keep this hand-washing tradition alive. Because even in the New Testament letter of James says that religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is to care for orphans, widows, in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. James 1:27. At least it seems that they were trying to fulfill the last part of what it says about religion, about not being stained by the world. You know, to the woman caught in the act of adultery in John 8, Jesus says to her, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. To the unclean woman who'd been unclean for 12 years goes and she touches the hem of his garment. And he says to her, daughter, your faith has made you whole. Even the crowds that followed him, who knows what kind of people were in that crowd, but Jesus looked at them and he said, oh, would you look? Would you just look? They're like sheep without a shepherd. Those poor folks don't have a clue what their life is about and what they need to do. I mean, you'll always see Jesus doing that. They're like sheep without a shepherd, saying that about people. But not here. He takes one look at these religious leaders of the day and says, Isaiah got it right. He had you pegged from the beginning. You're all hypocrites. That's what Jesus says to them. You don't know the first thing about honoring God. He said, what you're following isn't godly conduct, but adherence to a bunch of human-made rules. It's all nothing but window dressing for your hypocrisy, is what Jesus says. Now, Jesus gives an example of this, not in our lectionary reading for the day, verses 9 through 13. You can read about that in Mark chapter 7 there. And what it was is they were using a law that had been created during that time. What they were doing is they were taking their wealth, and when maybe their mother and father were in need in some way, and what they would do is they would say, well, you know, I'd like to help them out, but I'm dedicating all of my things that I have using Corbin. That's what they would say, which is saying it's dedicated only to God, so it can't be used for anything else. And Jesus says, okay, you're following that rule, all right. But what about the commandment, love Or honor your mother and father. He said, what about that? He said, what about that? He gives an example. He's talking about getting around responsibilities that they really didn't want to honor God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's really what he was talking about. Not about their attempt to even honor God, but about what they were trying to do only for themselves. Jesus, in essence, says, look, you're missing the boat. You're majoring on the minors. You know, they had built a fence around the wall. They had built a fence around the wall to protect it initially, but the fence had become more important than what it was protecting. Years ago, there was a church in Louisville, Kentucky. And this church was surrounded by kids everywhere in that subdivision, just everywhere. Everywhere. And those kids there wasn't a park in that big subdivision, and the church had a very large yard. Sometimes those kids would get out there and play baseball. And you know what happens when kids play baseball? Sometimes a little church window would get broken. The church decided to do something about that, and so they put up a sign, and it said, "Keep out. This means you." Kind of shocking. Instead of saying, well, you know what, maybe if we built a fence there, or we put in a little place where they could play ball, and like that, they kind of lost the focus of really what ministering and reaching out was all about. Now, in some churches, they have an elaborate alarm system. Sometimes they do malfunction, but it does provide security and peace of mind. It protects what some hold dear within the walls of the church congregation. And when I first got to one church which had a rather sophisticated alarm system, I had to figure out how to punch in the right numbers to shut off the alarm. And it was my first Sunday there. And that afternoon, after the alarm had been reset and all that, we had 4 services on Sunday morning. I was pretty worn out by the end, and I was kind of napping, and my sister and brother-in-law and 10-year-old nephew came to visit, and they wanted to see the church, and we went in there, I unlocked the door, walked in, and all of a sudden the alarm started going off. Oh, and I started punching numbers. I didn't get it right. The alarms were blaring. The police get there, and I looked pretty scruffy too. I didn't have any ID, I didn't have nothing. I had on a t-shirt, shorts, and my nephew sees the police walk in there, and he said, "The cops are here. They're going to take us to jail." He's 10 years old, and he raises his hands. I said, "Christopher, put your arms down, son." And I said, "Officers," I'm the new pastor here. And I said, I don't know why. I'm having trouble shutting this alarm. Thank God they believe me. Thank God. For what it was worth, it let me know we had a system that worked. It was important. Security is important. There was especially one time that I tried to help a fellow that needed assistance. He showed up at the parsonage, and he said he needed money for gasoline to get back home. I think they were from somewhere in Illinois, and after we talked a bit, I told him to meet me over at the church. I'd get a ministerial alliance voucher, and he could get some gasoline at the station, and they could be on their way. Well, the young lady is with him said she was hungry, so I said, "Oh, well, I'll put together some food in a bag and take it over." When I drove back around behind the kitchen of the church, and I saw he wasn't in the van, I saw her, and I got out, I handed her the food, and I was driving around the front of the church, and I saw him standing back behind the fellowship hall by the door, and he had his hand on a guitar, and it was partially sticking in the bushes, and I thought, well, he's going to try to sell me the guitar. Poor guy, he's probably pretty desperate. So I get around by the front of the church, and before I can stick the key in the door, I hear the alarm going off. And all of a sudden it hit me. That guy got in that back door, and he stole one of the guitars from our contemporary service. Well, I tell you what, I didn't jump back in my car, but I started running around the side of that church. I was running at high speed. And those of you know I train in martial arts, and I'd been to a martial art class, and I still had my uniform. I don't know what this guy thought about me, running down there yelling at him, "Stop and stop and stop." And he got in his van, and he closed it up. And I ran, and I slung open the side of the van. I grabbed the guitar. I pulled it out. and I said, how dare you? I said, we were trying to help you. And I gave him kind of a brief sermonette, and he went on his way. Now, everybody thought that story most people thought it was humor. Some folks said, well, I'd do the same thing. And a good friend of mine said, you did what? He said, are you nuts? He said, the guy could have been armed. And maybe he was right. Maybe I should have let the police handle the matter. But without the alarm system, I would have never known that guy took that guitar, and he would have probably gotten away. I'm glad we had a system that would protect what we consider to be important. That is important. My friends, although it has its place, although I'm glad we had that alarm system, I still had to remind myself that it isn't the most vital part of any faith unit. Although we don't have an elaborate alarm system here, we got plenty of locked doors around here. And I have to tell you, the first few times when I first got here, I kind of felt like Maxwell Smart in the old Get Smart, TV series, you remember how he had to go through all the doors? I mean, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but I have to go through 5 doors to get in my office when I get here. And what? Security is important. I know it's important. I'm exaggerating all of this. I think security is important, but I have to remind us, because sometimes in a world when you become afraid, when the world is changing so much, you become afraid, and it's easy to slip into the guardian mode and thinking that's the most important thing. We always have to remind ourselves that the most important thing for us is our worship life, our fellowship, and our outreach of sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is the main thing. I don't think any of us would ever buy into thinking that, well, since our doors weren't locked properly, we can't have worship or Bible study or fellowship. That's kind of crazy, ridiculous. It all sounds that way, but I say it again to emphasize just how off-center it is to major on the minors, to put or to move less important things in front of what is vital. Churches may not necessarily do that with alarm or security systems, but sometimes, we can do that in other ways. Sometimes we get sidetracked by focusing only on the nuts and bolts of an organization, lose the vision of why God has called the church into being. And I think it was that impetus behind the reforming movement of John Wesley and his colleagues. Because you see, in the Church of England, when the church wasn't reaching out to folks, John Wesley and other Methodists go out to the fields, they start preaching, and they start bringing people in. People begin to follow, and he starts getting them to go to church, and the churches begin to say, what are you doing bringing people like that in the church? Because there were those in his day that forgot that a church is more than a museum or just a place like that. I mean, it's a place we need to reverence and take care of. But it's also a reminder of what our mission should be about. I believe Wesley and his followers helped a generation recover what's always been central to God's people. They zeroed in what should be vital in the life of God's people, and that is a vital relationship with Jesus Christ. Isn't that why we're here, my friends? Isn't it? Sometimes I think we can be more like Pharisees and scribes, and we're willing to admit sometimes we let our own human-imposed inventions get in the way. And perhaps an example of that may be that when some folks think dress codes become more important than inviting people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And thanks be to God that you folks are not like that at all. Thank you. Thank you. This is obvious, and I'm aware of this. This is very obvious. But there are some that may say, need to come to church dressed decently, and I agree decency is important, but different people may have different ideas by that definition. Some may feel that if I wore my Arkansas Razorback tie here one Sunday, that may be indecent, and folks who are Mizzou fans, and maybe they may be right. I know at least a couple of churches that started a service that they call blue jeans only. And to me, that's just as exclusive as saying, well, suits only. Now, I'm sure their intention was not to exclude, but to reach out to people who may not have felt welcome. And that was a very ingenious ploy. But the important thing to remember is that we are called together to thank God in this place, to open up our lives for the power of the Holy Spirit to be transformed in the image of Jesus Christ, to disciple the world. Squeeze it right in there. That's what it's about. That's the core of our calling. That's the marrow of our mission. There's another aspect of spiritual life here that's important to note. Jesus points out that purity, again, isn't so much about the outward as it is the inward, too. You know, some of Jesus' contemporaries thought that if they ate only certain foods and hung out with the right people, that they could remain pure and undefiled or keep their religious stuff all clean. Well, Jesus takes us one step deeper into understanding the problem of broken humanity. It all begins on the inside, not on the outside. Luke presents the issue this way. He said, the good person out of the good treasure of the heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure of the heart produces evil. For it is out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. Well, my friends, the heart, the reasoning, the willing, the planning part of us is a lot like an antenna. Now, I have to ask this because times have changed. Does everybody know what an antenna is? You know, when I grew up in B.C., no, not before Christ, before cable, our family had a giant antenna, aerial. Anybody remember those days when you could get only 5 channels if you were lucky? Maybe 10, yeah. There's some others there. And actually, at my house, before we got one of those fancy motorized rotors, it took 3 people to change the channel. It was a family event. When it was time to watch your favorite program, it took 3 people to change the channel. One person at the TV, one person at the door, one person who had that big pole with antenna attached and would turn it a certain way. No, turn it back north. No, a little bit more to the south. You remember those days like that, right? Okay, good. Now you know what an antenna is. Well, if our hearts are tuned away from Christ, the kind of things mentioned here happen: murder, slander, pride, and the rest. If our heart is turned toward Christ, we begin to experience the love of God for neighbor. It's like picking up the signal. And the further away our heart's antenna gets turned away from God, the fuzzier the picture of what it means to follow Christ gets. But the closer, the more it gets tuned to Christ, the clearer the picture within us about who it is we're supposed to be. All of our relationships are affected in a redeeming way when that signal becomes clear. We get a clear picture. You know, Rondell Bean recalls when he was growing up, he had a mother like mine that had a real thing about cleanliness, and his mother was a nurse, and from an early age, Ron was always taught that when he went through a push door, he would always use his fist to push the door open. And if he went through a pull door, he would use his little finger, and he would pull the door open with that little finger. And he said that all of his life, if he did that, he would be more likely less, germ-filled or germ-free, you might say. Well, Ron never forgot his mother's teaching. He said even at age 48, he said, I probably had the strongest little finger in America. One day Ron was serving a hot meal at a soup kitchen, and they were serving chili with 2 pieces of buttered bread, and on that particular day, and a man came through the line. It was even more scruffy and broken than the rest of them. And Ron was overwhelmed by his stench. And like a magnet, his eyes were pulled to that man's hands who were stained, dirty, and dried blood on his hands. And before he realized what was happening, the man grabbed Ron's hands in his, and he grabbed his hands and he said, I love you, brother. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for being here. And Ron, kind of swallowed hard. He was glad you came, because he was so taken by this Man grabbing his hand like that. Tried to smile. Well, this man shuffled off to one of the tables with his meal. The next man stepped up, and Ron was handing him a bowl of chili, and a little bit of chili spilled out on Ron's hand before he thought about it. He licked his hand. Oh, he shuddered from within. This was the hand that that man had clasped. He had licked something that smelly, dirty man had just touched. But as he thought about it, there was a new revelation for Ron. The light of awareness, he said, changed my vision. And he said, my heart began to warm with new understanding. Ron said no longer was Jesus only the handsome man I'd pictured in my mind and seen in paintings, but he said now he was a scarred, stubble-faced man who had fingers stained yellow. And he was dirty, and he smelled bad, and he wore cast-off clothes. And you know, I had just served Jesus Christ, chili and bread. I guess it's true what Jesus said in Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. People of God said.